My name is Richard Foltin. I'm Director of National and Legislative Affairs in the Washington, D.C. office of the American Jewish Committee, the global Jewish advocacy organization. AJC was founded in 1906 to protect the civil and religious rights of Jews in response to persecution of Jews then taking place in Tsarist Russia. Its initial efforts were directed at seeking to persuade American authorities to press Russia to change its policies, and also to battle the forces of exclusion in the U.S. that sought to prevent Jews and others from seeking a haven from persecution and a better life on these shores. Very soon, AJC's leaders came to understand that the rights of Jews could only be secure when the rights of all Americans and of all people are secure. Indeed, the very first case in which AJC filed a friend of the court brief in 1925 was in the U.S. Supreme Court case of Pierce against Society of Sisters, in which the court ruled, as urged by AJC, that Catholic parents had the right to send their children to religious school rather than comply with a local law requiring their children to go to public schools. At the time, relations between faith groups were far from the norms of cooperation and fellowship, if not always agreement, between religious communities that thankfully generally characterizes those relations in the United States today. So what drew Jews to come to these shores in their millions at the turn of the 20th century, as so many others from other lands and of other communities want to do today? They were fleeing persecution and economic changes that led to harsh deprivation for many. With all of this country's flaws, for all of the reality of religious discrimination and anti-Semitism that very much marked the American scene in those days, far more so than today, this was a land in which Jews were treated far differently than they had been in the old country. It was not all about economics or even the absence of persecution. It made a difference that this was a nation without an official religion, with a separation of church and state, encapsulated by the constitutional prohibition on government establishment of religion and abridgment of the free exercise of religion, and by the Constitution's bar on a religious test for public office. In crafting these protections, the framers set the stage for a society that, by being neutral, not only among religions, but as between religion and non-religion, could make members of all faiths and of none full and welcome participants in the larger community, thereby enhancing and not diminishing religion, as well as evading the deep and often violent clashes based on religion that were characteristic of their time. The more religiously diverse the United States has become, the more the wisdom of those constitutional safeguards becomes evident. It is not surprising that the great cross-section of Jewish Americans, even if they do not always agree on how these principles should be applied, have come to see separation of church and state and the respect for diversity of belief that is at its base as a key factor in what has made this a welcoming society for members of their minority faith. Of course, it is one thing to state these principles of no establishment and free exercise in the abstract, but not oh so easy in practice. To the present day, we continue to see the citizenry, courts, and elected officials of our pluralistic nation wrestle with weighty questions as to the meaning of separation of church and state, not least how best to accommodate religious belief and practice while balancing other important interests, such as non-discrimination, as well as how best to avoid the appearance of government endorsement of religion while not excluding the religious voices from the public square. I will be part of a panel this afternoon that will speak to the need to build a framework that respects both religious liberty and other important interests. Suffice it to say for now, as Dr. Diop noted in his opening remarks, that a key challenge faced by society is how to reconcile other liberty and justice interests with the fact that there are religious institutions and individuals who march to a different drummer than the prevailing norms of society. This is perhaps the greatest test of how seriously we take religious freedom. However, when draws that balance, it is critically important that there be an underlying structure, whether established by a constitution in this country or by basic laws or perhaps by judicial decree in other countries, that is neutral as to matters of religious belief and in which members of all faiths and of none can work and live together across deep differences on issues of conscience, belief, and practice. If we are to talk of a model for peaceful coexistence, such a structure is an essential part of that model. For all the importance of these structural protections of religious liberty, there are other structures that are essential as well. Some 11 days ago, Americans were confronted by the spectacle of a march in an American city in which white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the Ku Klux Klan chanted "blood and soil" and "Jews will not replace us," along with other displays of hatred, accompanied by acts of violence that culminated in the murder of a young woman by an extremist who plunged his car into a group of peaceful counter-demonstrators. 19 others were injured as well. This violence and hateful rhetoric has been blood-chilling for all people of goodwill, but I dare say, particularly for American Jews, including this child of Holocaust survivors who live to come to America and begin new lives only through the grace of God, and each of whom lost parents and other relatives in the conflagration of the Shoah. Shockingly and sadly, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, rather than serving as a voice of morality and as a unifier in response to what amounted to an act of domestic terrorism, the President of the United States conveyed a moral equivalence between these white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK with those who oppose them, disregarding that there is no moral equivalence, nor can there be, between one side that wishes to celebrate the racist, secessionist Confederacy and the other side which represents, with whatever flaws, the voices of inclusion and diversity. The events of Charlottesville did not take place in a vacuum. In the first half of 2017, following a year in which anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic rhetoric too often infected our nation's political discourse, and of course also anti-Muslim rhetoric, there were scores, even hundreds, of incidents of religion-based attacks or threats against Jewish institutions, and also against Muslims, persons perceived to be Muslims, and Muslim institutions. These recent incidents are part of a rising trend in hate crime incidents generally and in the frequency of violent crimes against people of faith and religious communities in particular, including a particularly alarming rate of increase in attacks directed at Muslims, even as the attacks on Jews remain the highest in absolute numbers among crimes based on religious animus. Like acts of terror, crimes based on religious animus, whether directed at individuals or institutions, are meant to reverberate within the community against which they are directed. And whoever the target, these crimes pose a danger to the religious freedom and security of all Americans, regardless of whether or not they are part of the group directly targeted. With regard to anti-Semitism, this ancient hatred is on the rise around the world. For years, the most frequent and deadliest manifestations of anti-Semitism have taken place in European cities, while the United States remained relatively insulated from such incidents. It is now abundantly clear, even as the rate and intensity of anti-Semitic incidents in this country remains but a fraction of what is occurring abroad, that the U.S. is not immune to this type of hate. In too many instances, even before Charlottesville, our democratic values have not protected American Jews and Jewish institutions, Jewish communities rather, from threats, intimidation, and attack. The growing number of incidents affecting Jewish community centers and synagogues and campuses, not to mention expressions of anti-Semitism through the social media and now at white supremacist rallies, must be addressed proactively, purposefully, and specifically to ensure that such sentiments, whether against Jews or against other segments of our pluralistic society, do not take hold in our nation. The first essential step, and this and other steps are applicable to other victimized communities as well, is to call out anti-Semitism and to declare it beyond the pale, not once, but repeatedly, and whenever incidents arise. Jewish communities, all American communities, and the public need to hear from the highest levels on down that anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and bigotry violate our core values and will not be tolerated. As Jewish communities around the world, including now within the US, feel besieged, and as other minority communities across the globe are persecuted, marginalized, or made victims of atrocity and genocide, the refrain, "never again," cannot be repeated too often. Moreover, there are specific actions, some of which are outlined in an AJC action alert released this week, which can and should be taken by the administration and Congress, as well as by the states. I spoke earlier of the sharp rise in anti-Muslim crimes. There is no question that our nation faces a threat of homegrown terrorism from both the far right, as exemplified in Charlottesville, but also from individuals inspired by Islamist extremist ideology. Both of these threats loom large for the Jewish community, which here and abroad has too often been specifically targeted for hateful rhetoric and acts of violence. But even as we must not hesitate to identify and confront the very real threat of these extremist ideologies and be vigorous in thwarting their efforts to follow through on their hateful visions, we must also be ever vigilant against rhetoric that smacks of stereotyping members of a particular faith and actions that amount to discrimination against, much less persecution of, members of a faith group based on their identity or beliefs, or on the illegal actions of a few which become attributed to the larger community. As victims of discrimination, demonization, and persecution ourselves, the Jewish community is all too aware that a threat to the religious liberty of Muslims is a threat to the religious liberty of all. Coming back to Charlottesville, even as we have witnessed the renewed expression of a repulsive ideology, we have also seen people of many faiths and backgrounds and from across the political spectrum come together to stand in solidarity against these forces of hatred and oppression. Those expressions of solidarity are an outgrowth of what this country has gotten right, even as with all human societies, there's much that it has gotten wrong, in creating a framework for coexistence across differences of religion and belief. So these are elements of a model for peaceful coexistence, maintaining a legal structure that respects religious belief and practice, even as it tends to other important interests, the coming together of national leaders in the broader society to reject hate and bigotry, whoever the target, and rejection of stereotyping and discrimination as if the actions of one individual or group should be attributed to entire faith communities. There are other things to be done beyond the legal regime or societal responses to and condemnation of hate and violence. First, there is the need for education. Education as to the principles of religious liberty and respect for diversity, beginning in elementary school and continuing through adult life. And even as it is essential that religious indoctrination not be part of the public school curriculum, it is crucial to rounded education, as the US Supreme Court long ago observed, that students be educated in comparative religions, as well as learn about the role of religion in history and in the arts. Second, book learning is not enough. Many Americans have never met a Muslim or a Jew. There is no replacement for the encounter with people of diverse faiths and backgrounds in order to learn of the common humanity and values that they share, to build relationships, and to join together in common cause. As but the latest example of its many decades of outreach to and relationship building with other faith communities, AJC late last year convened the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council in partnership with the Islamic Society of North America, composed of dozens of leaders from the American Muslim and Jewish communities. The council has primarily been focused on advocacy regarding legislative and administration responses to religion-based hate crimes. This is advocacy worth doing for its own sake, even as it also has the benefit of the building of understanding and relationships between the two communities. Alongside these efforts, AJC regional offices are partnering with their local Muslim communities to similarly build these relationships and lines of communication. Judge Learned Hand famously said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of the liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The Constitution, the law, the courts are essential parts of the effort to create models of coexistence, but so also is the need to reach out to better understand the minds of other men and women. Let us join hands in that noble effort." Thank you.